Alright, so in this video I'm going to go over a couple questions that you had here on the test. So for the first one here, it gives me two statements. One of them, that vertical angles are congruent, and the other one, and this little part here is important. It says two lines are not parallel. Okay, so when I go to write out P and not Q, so remember that negation symbol, that little squiggly, means that I've got to have the opposite meaning. So since it already has a not, that means I have to take it out when I'm doing the negation. So that's why in this case we have vertical angles are congruent and two lines are parallel. It's almost like you have a double negative. Two lines are not parallel. So they cancel out and you're just left with two lines are parallel. Okay, so make sure you're always kind of reading the original statements carefully, because sometimes it already has a not in there and you'll have to take it out. Other times it doesn't have one there and you would maybe have to add it in. Okay. For 15 here, so it says if two angles are supplementary, then their sum is 180. Okay. Now, for the next part, then it says if two angles sum is not 180, then they are supplementary. So I'm going to first talk about how it is law of contrapositive. So if I look at the first statement and I were to compare that to the second statement here, it says two angles sum is not 180, then they are not supplementary. You'll notice that I have just written out the contrapositive. Okay, so that's why it's going to be law of contrapositive. Why it is not law of syllogism. If I had law of syllogism, it would have had to been something like this. If two angles are supplementary, then their sum is 180. They would have also had to say something like, and if two angles sum is 180, then something else. So they would have to give you two if-then statements. Then finally their conclusion would have been thus or therefore if two angles are supplementary, then ... Okay, so I would skip out, or I would strike through the center part here that match between the two. So it's like I'm cutting out the middleman. Okay. So when I'm using law of syllogism, I'm cutting out the step that matches between the hypothesis and the conclusion. So that's going to be my final. The part after the thus should have been if two angles are supplementary, then whatever. Okay. Another example of when you're using law of syllogism. Let's say if two angles are a linear pair, then they are supplementary. And if two angles are supplementary, then they sum to equal 180. So if I was doing law of syllogism, get this over here, then my conclusion would be thus if two angles are a linear pair, then they sum to equal 180. So I'm basically striking through the middle part here because the part in red matched. So all I'm left with is the part in purple. If two angles form a linear pair, then they sum to equal 180. So that's going to be when you're using syllogism. So you're going to end up having 3 if-then statements when you have law of syllogism. When you've got law of contrapositive, they gave me one statement, then they gave me the contrapositive. That was it. We only had 2 things. Okay. For the next one, I did credit your test on this one because the original answer had, the original question had this symbol here mixed up. Okay, but I'm going to go ahead and explain it as well because it is usually a difficult one to look at. So I've kind of drawn a Venn diagram here for my A, B, and C. So I got A, B, and then C. So when I'm going through the answer choices, I'm going to actually show both of them here. Sorry, I'm trying to find my paint bucket. There it is. Okay. So for the first one here, it says A. So this is my A. Or I could be in B. Or I could be in C. So basically I could be in any of these 3 circles. This would be my Venn diagram for A or B or C. Okay. Now for my next Venn diagram, you'll notice it says A. So I could be sitting in the circle of A, or I could be in B, or I could be in C. Okay, so that first part's the same still. Okay, that's what I just did there, underlined in red. For the next part, it says minus B and C. So I've got to take out the 2 pieces where I've got B and C overlapping. So if I look here, my B and C are overlapping in these 2 pieces. So I had to cut them out. It's no longer an option that I'm in B and C there. So that's now this first piece that's underlined in red is what I've got. Okay. Now for, excuse me. For the next part, I'm going to do this one in a little bit different color here. So that one was the red one that's underlined. So now I'm going to do the next one here, and I'm going to underline this one blue. So when I go to change this one here, excuse me while I get this set up here, I'm going to basically look, since it's an or statement, where they overlap. Okay, so if I look, I've got A, excuse me, I've got A and B and C. So the only spot where I'm in all 3 circles is right at the center there. So when I say A and B and C, I've got to be in all 3 circles at once. If I had the or statement, that means I could be in either A or B or C. But this one, you'll notice it says and, so that means I got to be in all three at the same time. Okay. So now, when I go to look at this, I've got an or statement. So that means I can either be in this Venn diagram or this little piece. So I'm going to actually overlap these, if it'll work out here. I don't think it's going to let me overlap them. But if you were to look at this top Venn diagram, the only part that is missing, that is included in the other piece, is this little chunk right there in the center. Okay, so when I go to overlap these, the only extra piece I'm going to add is going to be the center, because this center is the A and B and C. It's right there at the center. Okay. So the Venn diagrams, I know they're not the easiest. Usually they just have one with 3 circles on the SOL test, and at least from the release items, it's usually you have to click, kind of like I just did with the paint bucket here, which sections the Venn diagram holds with a statement. So it's kind of reverse of what this question is, but most people find it a little bit easier than trying to compare 4 statements to one Venn diagram. Alright, so don't hesitate to email back if you still got questions on that one. I know it's kind of hard to see, so I may have to kind of talk you through that one. 421 here. So it says, which is an equivalent statement for not P and Q. Okay, so this one, it's almost like you've got to kind of distribute that not to all 3 parts. So I've got the opposite of P, which you got matches that one you had. Then I've got to do opposite of the sign they gave me. So I had an and sign, so I got to switch it to an or. And then finally opposite of Q, which you had as well. So when you've got this negation outside the parentheses, make sure you're also doing the opposite of the symbol in between. So instead of having an and statement, I'm going to have an or statement. So again, if you have any questions on these, please don't hesitate to let me know, and maybe I can talk you through it a little bit different way.